Before the highways, before the railroads, before the trucks that now haul timber down paved mountain roads, there was something else, something that has been almost completely forgotten. If you had stood in the forests of the Pacific Northwest in 1870, you would have heard it before you saw anything. A deep, groaning thunder rolling through the trees, a sound so loud, so sustained, that loggers claimed you could hear it from 2 miles away on a quiet morning. The earth itself seemed to vibrate. That sound was the voice of the skid road. And the men who built those roads, who greased them with rotting fish oil, who drove 16 oxen through virgin timber so dense you couldn't see 30 feet in any direction. Those men created the first highways through the American wilderness. They built roads out of trees to move trees. And almost nobody alive today knows their names. This is the story of the skid roads, how they were built, what it cost to work them, and why the term Skid Row exists in every American city, named after a single street in Seattle where broken loggers came to die. Picture the Pacific Northwest coast in 1850. We're talking about a forest that stretched essentially unbroken from Northern California to Alaska. Douglas firs 300 feet tall, western red cedars so massive that a single tree could produce enough lumber to build an entire house. The wood was worth a fortune. San Francisco was burning down every few months, and each time it burned, it needed more lumber to rebuild. The California gold rush had created a city of 100,000 people overnight, and every single one of them needed shelter. The timber was there, millions of board feet of it, standing right on the coastline, some of the biggest trees you could find anywhere on Earth. But there was a problem, a fundamental, seemingly unsolvable problem. The trees were on the hillsides. The sawmills were at the water's edge, and between those 2 points was wilderness so dense, so tangled with undergrowth, fallen logs, and ravines that you couldn't walk through it in a straight line, let alone drag a log weighing 30,000 pounds. This wasn't some minor logistical challenge. This was the central obstacle facing every logging operation on the Pacific coast. You could fell the timber. That was hard work, but it was possible with axes and crosscut saws. What you couldn't do, at least not with any technology that existed in 1850, was move those logs from the stump to the mill. Horses couldn't do it. The terrain was too steep, too tangled, the logs too massive. Mules would break their legs in the first ravine. Wagons were useless in forests that had no roads. You could roll logs downhill, but they'd catch on stumps, pile up, crush anyone standing nearby. You could float them down rivers, but not every cutting site was near a river. What the loggers needed was something that didn't exist. They needed to create a smooth surface through chaos, a highway through hell. And so they invented the skid road. The concept sounds almost primitive when you describe it. Take logs, lay them crosswise across the forest floor, and then drag your timber over them like rolling a barrel over a series of bumps. But the execution? The actual building and operation of a working skid road? That was something far more sophisticated than it appears. Here's how it worked. First, you chose your route. This was the job of the road monkey, a specialized logger who spent his days walking the forest between the cutting site and the mill, looking for the path of least resistance. He was looking for natural grades, avoiding the steepest ravines, finding routes that could be graded with hand tools. A good road monkey could save a logging operation thousands of dollars by finding a route that was a quarter mile shorter or 5 degrees less steep. Once the route was chosen, the crew went to work. And by crew, I mean dozens of men with axes, crosscut saws, shovels, and a kind of brutal determination that's difficult to imagine today. They cut the undergrowth, they felled the smaller trees, they graded the ground by hand, some moving dirt with shovels and picks to create something approaching a level surface. Where the terrain dipped, they built up. Where it rose, they cut down. All of this by hand. All of this in countries so remote that if you got hurt, you might die before anyone could get you to a doctor. Then came the skids themselves. Every 5 to 8 feet along the entire length of the road, they laid a log crosswise. Not just any log. These skids were usually between 8 and 12 inches in diameter, chosen for straightness and rot resistance. They were half buried in the ground, with only the top surface exposed. The selection of skid logs was its own specialized skill. You needed wood that wouldn't rot in the first wet season. You needed logs straight enough to provide a consistent surface. You needed material that would hold up under thousands of pounds of pressure, day after day, week after week. A bad skid could splinter under a heavy load, sending shards of wood flying like shrapnel. A rotted skid could collapse without warning, dropping the log into a hole and snapping chains under the sudden tension. The men who selected and placed the skids developed an eye for timber that takes years to acquire. They could look at a standing tree and know whether it would make good skids or whether its grain ran wrong, whether it had hidden rot at the center, whether it would last 1 season or 5. This knowledge came from experience, and experience came from watching what happened when you chose wrong. Think about what that means in practical terms. A skid road might run a mile from the cutting site to the mill. A mile is 5,280 feet. At one skid every 6 feet, that's nearly 900 individual logs that had to be cut, transported, positioned, and partially buried for one road. And many logging operations maintained multiple roads simultaneously. The positioning had to be precise. Too far apart, and the dragging log would sag between skids, digging into the dirt and creating resistance. Too close together, and you wasted material. The grade had to be calculated so that gravity would assist the oxen, but not so steep that the logs would run away from the team. Every decision involved trade-offs. Every mistake had consequences. The construction crews worked in all weather. Rain made the ground unstable, caused cave-ins in the graded sections, turned the work area into a mud pit where men lost their footing and their tools. But the mill needed logs. The ships were waiting at the dock. Nobody got to stop working because the weather was bad. I've read accounts from men who built skid roads in February rain, their clothes soaked through before breakfast, their fingers so numb they could barely grip their tools. They worked because they needed the wages. They worked because stopping meant being replaced by someone desperate enough to keep going. They worked because the economic logic of the timber industry had no room for human frailty. But the skids alone weren't enough. Dragging a log that weighs 15 tons over bare wood would require more pulling power than any team of animals could provide. The friction would be too great. The wood would splinter and catch. The whole operation would grind to a halt, so they greased the skids. And here's where the story gets into territory that sounds genuinely difficult to believe. The grease of choice, the substance that made the entire skid road system possible, was dogfish oil. Dogfish sharks were abundant in the Pacific Northwest waters. They weren't valuable for their meat or their fins, but their livers produced oil, and that oil was cheap. Incredibly cheap. So cheap that logging operations could afford to buy it by the barrel and spread it over miles of skid road. The economics drove everything. You could use bear grease, which worked well, but bears were hard to kill in sufficient quantities. You could use beef tallow, but cattle were expensive and needed to be imported. You could use whale oil, but that was reserved for more profitable uses, lighting lamps in eastern cities. Dogfish oil was the residue of an industry that didn't know what else to do with its waste product. The smell was the problem. Or rather, the smell was one of many problems, but it was the one that everybody remembered. Dogfish oil doesn't just smell like fish. It smells like fish that has been dead for a week in summer heat. It smells like rot and corruption and organic decay. And when you heat it, when friction warms it on a working skid road, that smell intensifies. It saturates everything within 100 yards. The men who did this spreading were called skid greasers, and by every account that survives, theirs was the dirtiest, most miserable job in the entire logging industry. Imagine carrying a bucket of rancid fish oil through the forest, slopping it onto logs with a swab made of burlap and sticks, while the summer sun bakes the oil into your clothes and skin. The smell was indescribable. Loggers wrote about being able to identify a skid greaser from 100 yards away by scent alone. Skid greasers were usually the newest men in camp. It was the job you gave to someone who hadn't proven themselves yet, or who was too old or too injured for the more demanding work. The veterans avoided it. The bull punchers looked down on it. The only thing lower than a skid greaser in the camp hierarchy was being unemployed, and yet the entire operation depended on them. Without grease, there was no sliding. Without sliding, there was no lumber. Without lumber, there was no payroll. The skid greaser, despised and avoided, covered in oil that would never fully wash out, was the essential link in the chain. Try explaining that to the men who held their noses when he walked past. The grease had to be applied constantly. Every few loads, the skid greaser would rush out onto the road with his bucket and swab, spreading a fresh layer before the next log came down. The timing was critical. Apply too little and the friction increased, slowing the operation. Apply too much and you wasted expensive oil. Apply at the wrong moment when a log was already descending and you would die. But the grease worked. A properly greased skid road reduced friction so dramatically that a team of oxen could pull logs that would otherwise be immovable. The wood slid over wood with a distinctive sound, a long groaning rumble that echoed through the forest. Now about those oxen. Think about logging in the Old West and your mind probably goes to horses. But the movies show horses dragging logs through streams. The calendar paintings feature heavy draft horses straining against harnesses. But the reality was different. For skid road operations, oxen were vastly preferred. And the reasons tell you a lot about what this work was actually like. Horses are smart. They're fast. They're responsive to commands. All of those qualities are advantages in most situations. But in the context of pulling logs down a skid road, every single one of those qualities was a liability. Horses are nervous. They startle. When something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong when you're dragging 30,000 pounds of timber down a grease slope, a horse will panic. It will try to bolt. And a bolting horse attached to a moving log will die, usually taking the driver and several other animals with it. Oxen are different. Oxen are patient. Oxen are calm. When a log starts to slide sideways, or the team hits a rough patch, an ox will simply stop and wait for instructions. It won't panic, it won't bolt. It will stand there chewing its cud while the driver figures out what to do. Oxen were also cheaper to feed. Horses need grain. Oxen can survive on grass and hay. In remote logging camps where every pound of supplies had to be packed in on mule trains, that difference mattered. A typical skid road operation used bull teams of 10 to 16 oxen. The animals were yoked in pairs, with the strongest pair at the front and the steadiest pair at the rear. They were guided by a man called the bull puncher, one of the most skilled and respected workers in any logging camp. The name sounds crude, and the reality sometimes was. Bull punchers carried long goads, sharp-pointed sticks that they used to direct individual animals. But the best bull punchers rarely needed to use the goad. They controlled their teams primarily through voice commands, using a vocabulary of calls and whistles that the oxen learned over years of working together. The vocabulary was extensive: commands for starting, commands for stopping, commands for individual pairs to pull harder or slack off, commands for turning left or right, for speeding up or slowing down, for the emergency stop that might save lives when a chain snapped or a log broke loose. Different bull punchers used different systems. Some favored whistles, others preferred spoken words. Still others used a combination of both. The oxen learned their driver's particular style. A team that had worked with one bull puncher for years might not respond to commands from a stranger, even if the stranger used the same words. The bond between driver and team was specific and personal. This relationship gave good bull punchers significant leverage in the industry. A man who could reliably control a 16 oxen team was worth more than a man who couldn't. When a bull puncher quit or died, his replacement had to spend weeks or months building rapport with the team before they would work together smoothly. Some operations paid premium wages to keep their best bull punchers from leaving for competitors. A good bull team stayed together for years. The animals knew each other, they knew their driver, they knew the work. When you see photographs of these teams from the 1880s, look at the positioning. The oxen aren't straining chaotically against the yoke. They're pulling in unison, their bodies aligned, their strength coordinated. That synchronization didn't happen by accident. It was trained over thousands of hours of shared labor. The oxen themselves lived hard lives. They worked from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week, pulling loads that would have killed horses. They ate their feed in the dark after the day's hauling was done. They slept standing in rough corrals where the mud sometimes came up to their knees. In winter, they worked through rain and snow that matted their coats and cracked their hooves. A working ox in the Pacific Northwest timber industry might last 5 years before breaking down. Some lasted longer, some less. When they couldn't work anymore, they were usually slaughtered for meat, their hides sold, like their bones discarded. The sentimentality we sometimes feel about working animals didn't have much purchase in an industry built on extraction. The oxen were tools. When tools wore out, you replaced them. The logs themselves were prepared for skidding through a process that modern viewers might find surprising. The front end of each log was cut into a shape called a snipe, a rounded nose that would ride up over the skids rather than catching on them. This snipe was cut by hand with an axe, a skilled job that required reading the grain of the wood and knowing exactly how much material to remove. Then the log was dogged, attached to the team, by massive iron hooks called log dogs that bit into the wood. The chain ran from the dogs to the yoke, and when the bull puncher gave the command, and 16 oxen leaned into their harness simultaneously. The log moved. If you've never seen a 30-foot log start sliding down a grease skid road, it's difficult to describe the sensation. There's a moment of stillness, of gathering tension, and then the weight shifts. The log begins to slide, picking up momentum, the grease smoking slightly where the friction is greatest. The sound rises from a whisper to a roar. And here's where men died, because once a log that weighs 15 tons starts moving downhill on a grease surface, physics takes over. The bull team isn't pulling anymore. They're braking. They're trying to slow the log's descent, to keep it from running away, from overtaking them, from crushing them under its weight. The bull puncher walked beside his team, shouting commands, watching the log behind them. If he saw it gaining too fast, he'd call for the team to shift sideways, letting the log slide past. If a chain broke, if a yoke snapped, if anything went wrong at the moment of maximum tension, men and animals died. The physics were unforgiving. A log weighing 30,000 pounds, moving at even 10 miles per hour, carries more kinetic energy than a modern automobile traveling at highway speed. And unlike a car, a log has no brakes. Once it starts moving, it keeps moving until friction stops it or until it hits something. The bull punchers knew this. They lived with it every working day. They developed a sense for when things were about to go wrong, a kind of intuition born from watching dozens of close calls. The smart ones trusted that intuition. When something felt wrong, they got off the road. And when the log started gaining too fast, they dove for cover. When the chains made a sound they didn't like, they abandoned the team and ran. The ones who weren't smart, or weren't lucky, or couldn't move fast enough, they ended up under the logs. Some died instantly, crushed so completely that there was barely anything left to bury. Others died slowly, trapped under timber that couldn't be moved in time, bleeding out while their friends tried to cut the wood away from their shattered bodies. There are records, scattered across local newspapers and company ledgers, of entire bull teams being killed by runaway logs. 16 oxen crushed, their driver crushed with them. The log continuing down the skid road until it either reached the landing or crashed into the forest. The newspapers covered these deaths matter-of-factly. Accident at the Yesler Mill claimed 3 lives, a headline might read, a paragraph of details, names if they were known, and then on to the next story. The deaths were news, but not very interesting news. They happened often enough that they'd lost their power to shock. The company ledgers were even more terse. Lost 1 teamster, 1 greaser, replaced Thursday. The mathematics of labor and production reduced to entries in a book. The skid greasers worked during pauses in the hauling, rushing onto the road between loads to reapply the dogfish oil. They had to move fast, they had to stay alert, because if a log came down while they were on the road, there was nowhere to run. The skid road was carved into the forest like a channel. You couldn't step off it into the undergrowth. You could only run, and you couldn't outrun 30,000 pounds of sliding timber. I've tried to find statistics on how many men died on skid roads during the peak era. The numbers don't exist, not in any comprehensive form. Nobody was keeping track at the industry level. Individual operations recorded their own losses, sometimes, but those records were often destroyed when companies went bankrupt or were absorbed by competitors. The best estimates I've seen suggest that logging as a whole was the most dangerous occupation in 19th century America, with fatality rates exceeding those of mining, railroads, and factory work. And within logging, the skid road operations were among the most hazardous. The combination of massive weights, steep grades, greased surfaces, and animal teams created conditions where catastrophe was never more than one mistake away. This is the reality that gets lost when we romanticize the logging era. These weren't rugged adventures in the wilderness. These were industrial operations conducted under the most primitive possible conditions, using human beings and animals as disposable components. The men were paid, yes. A bull puncher might make $2 a day, decent wages for the 1870s. But they were paid because the work would kill them or cripple them if they did it long enough. There was no workers' compensation. There was no disability insurance. There was no pension waiting at the end of 20 years of service. There was just the work and the slow accumulation of injuries, and eventually the day when you couldn't do it anymore. Which brings us to Seattle, and a man named Henry Yesler, and the street that gave the English language a phrase for human wreckage. In 1852, Seattle was barely a town, a handful of buildings on the shore of Elliott Bay, populated by maybe 100 settlers who were trying to make a living from fishing, trading, and the timber that surrounded them on every side. The forests came down to the waterline. Douglas firs grew so close to the beach that their branches almost touched the waves at high tide. Henry Yesler saw opportunity in that timber. He was a carpenter and millwright from Ohio, a practical man who understood machines and money. He arrived in Seattle in 1852 with a plan: build a steam-powered sawmill at the waterline, cut the timber from the surrounding hills, and sell the lumber to San Francisco. The California gold rush was creating insatiable demand. Whoever could supply that demand would get rich. But Yesler faced the same problem that every Pacific Northwest logger faced. The trees were on the hills. His mill was at the water. He needed a way to move the logs. So he built the first commercial skid road in Seattle. It ran from the sawmill on the waterfront, up the steep slope of what's now Pioneer Square, through what is today the center of downtown Seattle. Yesler and his crews laid the logs, greased the skids, and began hauling timber down to the mill. The road became the center of Seattle's early economy. Everything revolved around it. The taverns that served the loggers were built along its route. The boarding houses where they slept were nearby. The stores that sold them equipment, the doctors who patched them up, the undertakers who buried them, and all of them clustered along Yesler's skid road. And at the bottom, near the mill and the waterfront, were the establishments that served men at the end of their working lives. The flop houses, the cheap saloons, the places where a broken logger could spend his last dollars waiting to die. This stretch of Yesler Way, this lowest end of the skid road, became known locally as Skid Road in a different sense. Not the literal road itself, but the destination. The place you ended up when logging had taken everything from you: your health, your savings, your hope. By the 1890s, the phrase had spread. Other cities adopted it. Skid Road became Skid Row, and Skid Row became a term for any district where the broken and abandoned gathered. Los Angeles has a Skid Row. Chicago has a Skid Row. The phrase exists in the vocabulary of every American city. And it all started with a greased log road in Seattle, where the sound of sliding timber once echoed up and down the hillside. The Skid Road era in the Pacific Northwest lasted roughly 40 years. From the early 1850s to the early 1890s, this was the dominant technology for moving timber from stump to mill. Millions of board feet of lumber traveled down these greased highways. Thousands of men worked them. Hundreds died on them. Then the technology changed. The steam donkey appeared, a stationary engine mounted on a sled. It could be hauled into the forest and used to pull logs with steel cables. Instead of bull teams walking the length of a skid road, a steam donkey could sit at the landing and reel logs in like fish on a line. It was faster. It was cheaper. It required fewer men. Then came the logging railroads, narrow gauge tracks laid directly into the forest, with specialized locomotives that could climb grades no standard railroad would attempt. A logging railroad could move in a day what a bull team moved in a week. The skid roads fell into disuse, the crews dispersed. The bull punchers found new work or retired or died. The oxen were sold or slaughtered. Within a generation, the skid road had become a memory, and the men who built them, the men who greased them, the men who drove 16 oxen down grades so steep your legs burned just from walking them, those men vanished from history with barely a trace. Here's what I want you to understand. When you use the phrase Skid Row to describe a place of poverty and desperation, you're invoking a specific history. You're naming a place that existed because an industry chewed up men and discarded them. The loggers who ended up on Skid Row didn't fail because they were lazy or stupid or morally deficient. They ended up there because they gave their bodies to work that was never designed to keep them whole. A man who spent 10 years as a skid greaser, breathing dogfish oil fumes and stumbling over roots in the dark, that man didn't retire. He broke down. His lungs filled with fluid, his joints swelled until he couldn't straighten his fingers, and when he couldn't work anymore, when the camps had no use for him, he drifted to the cheap boarding houses at the bottom of the skid road. A bull puncher who slipped and fell under a rolling log, who survived but lost the use of his legs, that man didn't receive compensation. Yet he received charity if he was lucky, nothing if he wasn't. The company that employed him felt no obligation to care for him. He was a component that had worn out. The men who died on skid roads, crushed by logs or killed by falling trees or broken by accidents that nobody bothered to record, those men left behind widows and children who had no recourse. There was no investigation. There was no accountability. There was just the work and the next crew coming in to replace the dead. I think about the sounds they heard in those last moments, the groaning of the grease skids, the crack of the chain under tension, the deep thunder of a log sliding out of control. 2 miles away, someone might have heard that sound and thought nothing of it. Just another load coming down the road. Business as usual. What does progress cost? Or that's the question that echoes through every timber operation, every railroad cut, every mine shaft in American history. We measure progress in board feet and rail miles and tons of ore extracted. We count the lumber that built San Francisco, the railroads that crossed the mountains, the gold that funded an empire. But we don't count the men. We don't add up the bodies. We don't calculate the years of life that were extracted along with the timber. The skid roads of the Pacific Northwest moved the timber that built the western cities. Seattle itself grew from the profits of Yesler's mill. San Francisco rebuilt again and again using lumber that had slid down greased wood in the Washington forests. The entire Pacific Coast economy of the late 19th century ran on timber cut from virgin forest and transported by methods that killed the men who performed them. Those profits went to mill owners and timber barons. They went to shareholders in distant cities. They went to build mansions and endow universities and fund charitable foundations. None of them went to the skid greasers. None of them went to the bull punchers. None of them went to the widows or the orphans or the broken men waiting to die on Skid Row. This is the debt we owe. Not a financial debt, not something that can be repaid with money or monuments, but a debt of memory, a debt of acknowledgement, the obligation to know what it cost and who paid it. Because we walk on the ground they cleared, we live in cities they built, but we use phrases they created with their suffering, and we owe them at least the courtesy of remembering their names. Most of those names are lost. The company records, such as they were, rarely listed individual workers. A bull puncher might be recorded only as teamster in a ledger, his wages noted, his death noted if it happened on company property, his life otherwise unrecorded. But sometimes in local newspaper archives and cemetery records and the faded journals of the men themselves, names emerge. There's a grave in a small cemetery outside Olympia, Washington. The headstone is weathered, barely legible. The name appears to be William Fry, and the dates, if I'm reading them correctly, suggest he was 34 years old when he died in 1876. The cause of death isn't recorded, but the location and the timing place him in the heart of Skid Road country. I can't prove that William Fry was a logger. I can't prove he greased skids or punched bulls or died under a rolling log, but I can look at the demographics of that time and place and make a reasonable inference. Young men in their 30s working in rural Washington Territory in 1876 were overwhelmingly employed in one industry. Most of them came from somewhere else. Most of them were looking for wages that would let them start fresh. William Frey, whoever he was, came to Washington and died there. His headstone is the only record he left behind. Nobody alive today knows what he hoped to accomplish or what went wrong. He's just a name on a stone in a cemetery that drivers pass without noticing. But he was someone's son, maybe someone's brother, maybe someone's father. He had a life before he came to Washington, and that life ended on the western edge of the American continent, probably in circumstances that we would now consider unacceptable. There are hundreds of William Freys buried across the Pacific Northwest, thousands of them, men whose labor built the foundations of the modern West, and whose deaths were recorded only as entries in company ledgers. Lost one man today, replaced. That's the language of industry, the language of expendable human capital. It's not evil exactly. It's just the logical endpoint of treating people as resources rather than persons. I want you to hear the Skid Road. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself standing in the Washington forest in 1875. It's early morning, cold, the ground still wet with dew. You're positioned about a quarter mile from the cutting site, on a hillside above a skid road that runs down toward the distant sound of a steam whistle. At first, there's just the forest noise, birds, wind in the trees, the distant crack of axes on wood as the cutting crew works above you. Then the sound begins to change. A rhythmic clanking, metal on metal. That's the chains being attached to the logs. Voices shouting, too far away to make out words. The lowing of oxen as they're positioned at the head of the team. And then the sound that defines the skid road. A low rumble, almost subsonic at first, more felt than heard. The first log has started its descent. The grease is working, the skids groaning under the weight. The sound rises in pitch as the log picks up speed. And now you can distinguish the individual impacts as the timber crosses each skid with a thump. The bull puncher is shouting commands. The oxen are braking hard, their hooves digging into the packed earth beside the road. The log slides past your position with a rush of displaced air, the dogfish oil smoking where the friction burns it. 30,000 pounds of Douglas fir, moving at 15 miles an hour, controlled by chains and animals and the skill of men who do this every day. The sound fades down the hillside. The log reaches the landing. Immediately, the process begins again. Another log, another trip, 16 oxen straining in their yoke, a bull puncher walking beside them with his goad, skid greasers rushing to reapply the oil before the next load comes through. This continues all day. From first light until the evening whistle blows, the skid road rumbles with traffic. Logs descending, empty chains returning. The endless cycle of extraction that would continue until there were no more trees to cut, no more road to run, no more men willing to do the work. At the end of the day, the crew walks back to camp. Their boots are soaked with dogfish oil. Their muscles ache from 10 hours of hauling and pushing and shouting. They eat whatever the camp cook has prepared, beans and salt pork and bread that's already going stale. They sleep in bunkhouses that smell of sweat and wet wool. Tomorrow they'll do it again. The Pacific Northwest timber industry continues today, though transformed beyond recognition. Modern logging uses feller bunchers, massive machines that can cut and process a tree in minutes. The logs travel on trucks down paved roads, carrying loads that would have taken a full bull team a week to assemble. Nobody greases skids with dogfish oil. Nobody drives 16 oxen down a grade so steep you can barely stand on it. The skid roads themselves have mostly vanished, reclaimed by the forest or buried under development. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces. There's a section of forest near Snoqualmie where the undergrowth parts along an unusually straight path. The ground is slightly depressed, the soil more compact than it should be. If you dig down a few inches, you'll find rotted wood, the remains of skids laid more than a century ago. The logs that crossed those skids became lumber that built houses in Seattle. Houses that burned down long ago or were torn down for redevelopment. The wood is gone. The houses are gone. The men who did the work are gone. But the trace remains. A line through the forest, a memory embedded in the ground itself, and the phrase remains too. Skid Row. Say those words and something registers, even if you don't know the history. Skid Row means the bottom. Skid Row means the place where people end up when everything else has failed. It means a street in Seattle where broken loggers came to die, where the men who greased the roads and punched the bulls and risked their lives every day for $2 spent their last days waiting for the end. That's the inheritance. That's what the Skid Road era left us. Not just the lumber, not just the cities built from that lumber, but a vocabulary of failure rooted in the bodies of men who were used up and thrown away. When you understand that, when you really understand it, you can't use the phrase casually anymore. Skid Row becomes something specific, something historical, something that carries the weight of actual human suffering. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the reason we should remember the skid roads, the reason I'm telling you this story, is precisely because it's uncomfortable. Because it disrupts the easy narrative of progress and settlement and westward expansion. Because it forces us to acknowledge that the civilization we inherited was built on foundations that included the bodies of nameless men. The oxen are gone, the bull punchers are gone. The dogfish oil has long since rotted away, leaving nothing but a faint chemical signature in soil that nobody will ever test. But for 40 years, from 1850 to 1890, the skid roads rumbled with the sound of an economy extracting everything it could from the land and the men who worked it. The thunder rolled through the forest 2 miles in every direction. And somewhere at the bottom of the grade, the lumber stacked up on the docks, ready for shipment to cities that couldn't build fast enough. San Francisco burned. Seattle grew. Portland expanded. Vancouver developed. And on the skid roads, the logs kept coming. That's the sound of progress. The groaning of greased wood under 30,000 pounds of sliding timber, the shouting of bull punchers, the clanking of chains, and underneath it all, too quiet to hear, the slow accumulation of broken bodies, the widows learning the news, the orphans wondering where their fathers went, the old men coughing in boarding houses on Skid Row, and waiting for a death that took its time arriving. They built the West. We owe them more than we can ever repay. But we can remember. That much, at least, is within our power. The skid roads are gone. The men who work them are gone. But their story survives if we choose to tell it. And telling it, perhaps, is the only monument they'll ever receive. The greased wood, the dogfish oil, the thunder in the forest. Remember it.